the experts, the domain experts who are here with us, and all the other members of the bar who are present here, and of course my team at the registry. I always believe that gender is not a woman's thing. I think first and foremost we have to change mindsets of men if we have to have sense of gender equality in different aspects of our lives. So looking around in the audience, it's very important to understand that we have not just women talking about gender and rights, because it's not a trade union of women. Gender is not a trade union of women, but I think it's important that we change our own mindsets as we think of gender. Standing here today, I'm invigorated to see these energetic young lawyers involved in training dedicated for gender sensitization and prevention of sexual harassment. Years ago, when I was a young judge at the Bombay High Court, a dear friend of mine, of my spouse, who was then working for a multinational bank, told me of an incident which she encountered when she came to the Supreme Court as a young professional. And she says, and these were her words, she says, I was standing in one of the courtrooms at the back waiting for my counsel to arrive to argue the matter. And the next thing that I realized is I'm being felt up through my shirt by someone in the precincts of the Supreme Court. I was completely shocked, and I said, how can this happen? And she said, well, this does happen, and this is not really symptomatic of a particular court, but this is something which keeps on happening. And therefore, I think those were times when things were taken for granted, that if you're a woman, this is how you must accept your workplace to be. I think at least we have made a new conversation today, and we do realize that these are simply unacceptable things in our society. And therefore, I think that looking at the path which we have traversed in, say, the last decade, there are lots of milestones still to be achieved in the future. But at least today, our society, our profession has come to accept that some things are plainly unacceptable in terms of behavior in the workplace, in terms of your legal discourse. We prepared a handbook on gender just a few months ago. The object of preparing a handbook on gender, I have a written text, but I thought I'll just leave it aside and talk to you from the heart for a few minutes and then close. The object of a handbook on gender was very simple. I thought of this idea during COVID-19, when we were all at home and we didn't know how to spend our time. We were doing that occasional matter on the video conferencing platform. And I came across a judgment of one of the high courts, where there was a reference to a woman who had been subjected to gender violence. And the reference to gender violence in that judgment was, I felt, rather inappropriate. And I don't blame that judge. I attribute it to a variety of things. One, English is just not our language in that sense. So many of the judges in the district judiciary in the high courts do not belong to elite English backgrounds in terms of their education. So what they learn about legal language and legal English is what they hear from people around, what they read in other judgments. It's not something which is intrinsic to them. So there are some words which become part of the discourse. Like this woman was ravished. I've heard a particular judge say in his judgment, he enjoyed her body. And one of my female colleagues in the Bombay High Court told me that she got a judgment from a colleague, and then she said, what do I do? So you have to just walk up to that colleague and say, this is not legal discourse. But we have to begin this conversation with judges. And I think that conversation has begun across the board. So we prepared this gender handbook where we set out terms, explain why these terms are simply unacceptable. What is wrong with the use of those terms? It's not that they are politically incorrect, but because they reveal very deep-rooted gender or patriarchal stereotypes. But we must explain to our judges why these terms are wrong and what are the alternate terms which you can use for the use of these particular terms. And the gender handbook has been an unmitigated success. I know that there was a report on it carried in The Guardian. I was traveling to Singapore last year when one of our very young Indian Foreign Service officers who was looking after my visit, came up to me and she said, "Sir, we have a group of women IFS officers, and if you please," she said, "we have circulated this particular gender handbook across the women's group in the Indian Foreign Service." So it's been looked upon as something positive, which the judiciary has taken a lead in propagating awareness of. There are other issues which I think we need to confront today. First and foremost, gender sensitization is not just about words, about making people aware of the positives of our profession and the negatives of our profession as well. It's also about how we implement our notions of gender equality. As you heard a short while ago, we have had this unprecedented designation of women lawyers as senior counsel in the Supreme Court today. I thought we should begin first and foremost by inducting a woman senior advocate as part of the committee for the designation of senior counsel. So when one of the very distinguished seniors who was on the committee said that he has to seek leave of absence because he's writing a book on constitutional law, I thought this is a good time to have, it's a good time to have a woman on the panel for designating senior advocates. And I know what a great amount of positives that Mrs. Kiran Suri brought to the table when she engaged in discussions with us. I know what a great amount of contribution I have received in my own evolution when I've sat with women colleagues as a young judge of the Bombay High Court. I remember one of the criminal appeals, I sat for a very long time with Justice Ranjana Desai, who was a judge of the Bombay High Court, a very senior colleague of mine in the Bombay High Court. And the first day we sat, she says, it's disgusting. You will find almost every second criminal appeal, the facts are so similar. You will have a nylon rope, a can of kerosene, and a matchbox. And she says, that's the way women are treated. And you will realize that in case after case which comes up for hearing before us. But it was not just about being more sensitive to gender. It was also trying to discern the grain from the chaff. And one thing which I learned sitting with women colleagues in the Indian judiciary, I've been there for 24 years now, is that very often my colleagues would be in fact telling me that I was very wrong in my very liberal assessment of a gender perspective. And they would tell me that, well, I understand where you come from, but you are still wrong. And I must tell you, I have to take a hardline view on this one. So gender is not therefore just about protecting women's rights. Gender is also about bringing a fresh input, a more balanced perspective into decision making. So one thing which I think we have to disabuse our minds about is that having more women in the workplace or in positions of responsibility is not to propagate the cause of women necessarily, which is of course partly true. But that's not the be-all and end-all of having more women in the workplace or to deal with issues of women. The idea of finding a presence for women at the table, so to speak, is to enable them to bring a more holistic perspective about society, about the law in our case, and generally about our social life, which only women can bring into the area. Our profession has to confront some very hard facts. And I think that is one area which everyone has to speak about. And this is that we need first and foremost to ask ourselves the question, what are we doing today to make the legal profession more inclusive for women? Do lawyers' chambers readily accept women juniors as professionals? Or is the general perception that women are typically relegated to a second-class status when it comes to joining the chambers of a senior lawyer? If that is so, and this is so because this is something which one of my colleagues shared at lunch with me today when we were discussing the designation of senior advocates, which is that how do we ensure that more and more women are accepted as part of chambers? Possibly one of the reasons why women have taken to transactional work more than at the mainstream of the bar, as we would like to call it. So all of the women here are very, very eminent seniors are exceptions. But that exception has to be the rule. And I think in ensuring that the exception becomes the rule, we have to ensure that we cast a certain degree of obligation on the existing seniors, both men and women, to ensure that we provide a level playing field to women. During the course of my work in the last year as the Chief Justice, one of my missions has been to provide a more diverse registry which will run the Supreme Court. Now, as you know, we have officers in the registry who come from different parts of the country, and they carry on the core of the administration of the Supreme Court. Something which lawyers may not know. You may only look at the registrar listing with whom you have to get your case listed on a particular day. So we have officers, we have women officers who have come in and joined the Supreme Court during my tenure from Madras. We have Arunmoli, she's member Human Resources in the E-Committee of the Supreme Court. We have Sukita Pritham, a judicial officer, very senior judicial officer from the state of Haryana, who is manning the Center for Research and Planning, heading the Center for Research and Planning of the Supreme Court. We have Ms. Aparna Ajit, who is coming as Registrar Admin 1. She's a very senior judicial officer, Registrar General from the state of Assam. She was Registrar General of the Guwahati High Court. She has come in. We had Shalini, who had come in from the state of Kerala. She had to go back to Kerala. We have Uma Narayan, who has joined us in the library. She was a very senior registrar, and she's really in that sense doing the knowledge component of the work of the Supreme Court. She's been deeply and closely involved with digitizing the Supreme Court reports. So all of these women, they're not handling women's issues in the Supreme Court, if you please. They're handling the work which anyone else can handle. And they're handling it as effectively as anyone else. And I think that's the message which we have to send across by having. And very shortly we'll have another woman coming into the Supreme Court in a very important position of responsibility. Since I have to still sign the file, I can't still divulge her name. But the idea really is to ensure that we provide a public presence to women in the legal profession. Because repeatedly I'm asked this question, why do you have such few women judges in the Supreme Court? As I was coming here, Justice Suryakant just told me he's back from a trip to Malaysia, and he said 6 out of 9 judges in the Malaysian Supreme Court are women. And I said to myself, well, we have 34, and then we have Justice Hima Kohli, and we have Justice Nagaratna, we have Justice Bela Trivedi, Justice Indira Banerjee just retired, and Justice Sindhu Malhotra retired a short while before that. And the reason for it, to my mind, is very clear, and the reason is simple. When I have to sit down and pick out judges for appointment to the Supreme Court, you look at the available pool of talent. We are not like, say, the American Supreme Court, where you can just pick out somebody who is in the policy area. You look at the available pool of talent, which is basically senior judges of the high courts. Now, unless you create a level playing field within the legal profession, so that more and more women join the district judiciary, and more women are appointed to the high courts, you can't expect that you will have more and more women in the Supreme Court. You will have them provided the base of your pyramid is sufficiently broad and diverse to accommodate the needs of women. There are high courts in the country where there are no women. There are high courts in the country where there's only one woman. There are high courts in the country which are changing. You will have a dozen women. What is very satisfying is that when recruitments are being made to the district judiciary today, and across India, you will find this trend. When you are making recruitments to the district judiciary at the lowest level, at least 50% of the fresh recruits are women. There are states where 60% of the recruits are women. There are states where 70% of the recruits are women. And I dare say that's happening to the legal profession in the Supreme Court as well, by the number of people who are being designated as senior counsel. So my optimism for the future is that if we create a level playing field for women to succeed, and the reason why they are succeeding in joining the district judiciary is because it's a level playing field. You have competitive examinations. People don't decide subjectively who gets in and who is kept out. You have an objective process of selection. Once you have that, we have created a level playing field for women and changed the lopsided nature of the legal profession as it is, which is extremely patriarchal, which has to cater to all kinds of mindsets. I'll conclude with just one personal anecdote, which is that my late former wife applied for a job in a very leading transactional firm in Mumbai. And so she asked during the course of the interview, she said, well, what are the hours of work? and how many days leave would I get? So he said, well, you've prepared for an interview and you're already asking us about the hours of work and how many days of leave will you get? She says, yes, because I have a family. Well, the interviewer said, well, women with families don't join our firms. And this was something which has really stayed in my mind 16 years after she's gone. Because for the simple reason that I said that this really, in that sense, reveals a very typical mindset that if you have to succeed as a woman, you have to give up all notions of family. You have to think of nothing but your career. If you are a man, you can have a family. You can think of a more holistic life. So the kinds of demands which we place on women warps our whole process at the very inception. Namely, that we expect unrealistic things to happen when women join the workplace, but we don't place the same burdens on men. And I think therefore that change has to happen within each of us. And so these kind of training programs, I believe, are crucial because they carry on the conversation. They're not just important in terms of how many lawyers we are training, but in terms of spreading the word around, spreading the message around. Also in terms of gender discrimination, I think it's important that we send a message that we are a zero sexual harassment tolerance workplace. At any given point of time, I have 7, maybe more law clerks working for me. Every time that I have a new batch of law clerks, last year I had in fact 5 of them were women and 1 of them was a man. I always tell them there is one underlying rule in the office, that there is no tolerance of sexual harassment. Years ago when one of my law clerks, she joined my chamber, one of the peons in the office told her, she said, "Didi, हमारे लिए चाय क्यों नहीं बनवाते हो?" So she said, "मैं क्यों चाय बनवाऊँ आपके लिए?" So he turned around and told her, "आप मेरे लिए चाय नहीं बनाओगे तो आप ससुर जी के लिए चाय कैसे बनाओगे?" So this young law clerk came stomping into my chamber and she said, "Sir, you have to do something about this. This is absolutely discriminatory." So I told her, I said, "Look, I can always do that. I can call that peon here and I can fire him for it. I can send him back to the registry, or I can tell him why he was wrong. But I'm doing something different. I want you to go back and talk to him. Because I know where he comes from. And I think it's important that you talk to him and change the rules of the game." And so she engaged with him. She engaged with everyone in the office. And now everyone in my office, when you ask them, what do you do? Or what are your aspirations for your children? The chauffeur in the Supreme Court would say, "मैं बेटी को doctor बनाना चाहता हूँ." I talk to the liftman. I say, "What does your daughter do?" "साहब, बेटी तो engineer है." "साहब, बेटी chartered accountant है." And they say this with a great sense of pride. And I'm not talking of people occupying elite positions. You might be surprised by the extent of patriarchy and those who occupy elite positions. But this is the change happening on the ground. So India is changing. So I think these conversations carried in a multitude of settings convey an amazing message across our society that we are part of the change and we are contributing to the change. So thank you very much all the domain experts for coming and joining us here. Thank you all of you for joining in this conversation. And hopefully we'll have so many more women occupying positions of public responsibility. Just on Tuesday, we were in this very auditorium interviewing the candidates for appointment and designation as senior counsel. So we had the seating charts. I was sitting there with the Attorney General, Ms. Suri, Justice Sanjay Khanna, and Justice Bhushan Gavai. And we had all these young lawyers from the Supreme Court, young, not so young, old, not so old. And they were making their own cases for designation. And one thing which I was struck by is that the number of women in that audience. If you sit on the dais, when you sit on the dais in the SCB, just in our auditorium here, and you look at the audience, you're just amazed by the number of women who are there now in the audience. So it's now a question of transforming numbers to positions of responsibility.
And that's the challenge for us. Thank you very much.